Now I will show you how to set the field permissions for a chosen state. We'll create a new workflow. We'll call the workflow field permissions. Okay, the designer has loaded, so we'll just add a new state, add two actions to make a complete workflow, and now we can start using the field permissions. The field permissions are set for a given workflow instance in a given state, so they're defined per state. When we can define the field permissions in two ways. One way is just to drag and drop a role into the state. This way, the role which was dragged to the state will have full permissions to the fields in for the item in a given state. So if we go to the state details, you can see the field permissions button. When you click on it, you can see who has permissions and who has no permissions. One thing you need to remember is that the user is marked as with permissions, even if has only permission to one item, only to edit the field. So it doesn't matter if the user has full permissions to all the fields in the state or only one, they will be still displayed here. To see exactly what permissions given role has to the fields, we click on the edit button and we can see the list of all the columns, and these two columns have two parameters. One is edit and one is display. As you can see, you can edit all the columns with one checkbox, or you can edit every column separately. Currently in our list we have only one column, it's called title, and if we would like the outer role to be able only to display the column and not edit it, we would just have to uncheck this checkbox. If we would like to hide the the title column from the outer, we have to uncheck this checkbox. You need to remember that when the user has the edit permissions, they will automatically get the display. If they don't have the display, they will automatically have the edit permission removed. Basically, you set the permissions by checking and unchecking the checkboxes. What you need to remember is that these permissions are applied only to the view and edit form. They are not applied to the columns, they are not applied to any other interfaces that you may use to connect to the SharePoint list, like web services or the Excel list view and so on. So the settings you do here are only for the edit and display form. One thing you need to remember is that when you add a new field to the list, users will not have the permissions to this list. I'll show you how it works. We'll click OK now, and we will now open a new window with a list. We are now on the field permission list. We will now add a new column. Let's call it date. Okay, now you can see that we have two fields, title and date. You can see that these fields are visible. But when we go to the designer, you can see in the field permissions that this new column is not visible. To make it visible, you need to refresh the designer. Let's save the change. What is important for you to remember is that every new column will not be added as allowed to the users. So when you add a new column, you need to go back to the workflow designer, you need to open every state and select the permissions you want to assign. So you select edit here, and now all users will be able to use this date field. What is also important and what you also need to remember is that there are two additional columns that are created with the workflow. These columns are the workflow state and workflow status. So this means that before you implement the workflow, these columns are not created, and thus you don't have these columns on the field permission visible. So the best practice is after you create a workflow, deploy it as soon as possible just to get those two columns and run one item so the new column will be created. You need to remember that the new column is created only when the workflow runs for the first time. So the best practice is this. Have all the columns ready before you start making the workflow, and deploy the workflow and have one item using the workflow. This is not necessarily necessary, but it's just really useful because you don't need to change all the states later on. When you, for example, create 15 states and then you have to check all the checkboxes in those 15 states, it can be really time consuming. We'll now move to the list, create a new item. Okay, the new item was created. You can see that the new column has not appeared yet. We'll refresh the window. Okay, and you can see that we have these two new columns which are used for the workflow. So if we now return to designer, you can see now that the column will not appear yet. We have to refresh the designer. Okay, and now when we go to the field permissions, you can see that the column is now visible and we can use it. So you need to remember that the columns that are added after workflow was deployed will not be visible unless you explicitly check them to be visible. Also, you need to remember that once the workflow has started an item, these columns will not be visible unless you terminate the workflow and restart it again. Okay, so this will finish the field permission.